Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unpacking Possibility. In this next episode, we'll hear from shamanic practitioner and author, artist, and teacher, Mara Bishop. She has a new book out, Shamanism for Every Day. It's 365 practices that can help you to really connect to the divine within and all around you. But before you hear the episode, Mara and I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic that's really important and timely, and that often may not get discussed. And that's about the use of the term shamanism. And Mara, I'm going to let you take it away from there, right? Because, it's only recently that I learned that that could be kind of a loaded term. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, what it is and what it isn't for you.
Right. And in some ways it's complicated, and I am not someone from an indigenous culture. So in many ways it's more important what those of us who come from the culture that the word shamanism comes from, how they feel about it, right? So the word shamanism actually comes from the Tungus people of Siberia. It's a very specific word from a very specific group of people. But quite a long time ago, that word was used by anthropologists and kind of applied to, with kind of as more of an umbrella term for a collective of spiritual practices. So I think as we are all becoming, or I can't say all of us, as many of us are becoming more aware of the ideas of cultural appropriation and wanting to be clear about what words we use, what practices we use, and to be respectful. There are so many things that we're taking a new look at, right? So I think a lot about the word shamanism and want to be clear about how I'm using it in the context of my practice and in this book. Feel pretty sure that that may evolve, that there will be people who feel it's inappropriate, that there are people who feel it's fine, that we never get anything exactly right.
But it's the word that was used when you were going through your various years of study and apprenticeship.
Yeah, correct. So what I practice is core shamanism. So, and that is the kind of set of practices, beliefs, kind of ideas about spiritual healing that are not resident with any one particular group of people or tradition. It was started by Michael Harner. It's more kind of noticing what things are more globally consistent than about specific rituals or ceremonies. So at its heart, it's about direct revelation, right? At its the practices that I'm talking about in this book, in the work that I do, one-on-one with people, anytime that I would be teaching somebody to have a practice for themselves, it's about how are we individually connecting with our own personal helping spirits, the spirits of the place that we live in, right? It's not about teaching someone or using a ceremony or a practice that's from a particular culture that I don't belong to, right? That may be adequate, then that may not be adequate, right? But just to be clear,
It's your
that's how,
framework.
that's the framework that I work with under the umbrella of shamanism.
Right. And, and earlier you were saying it's not, you're making this distinction about core shamanism being an umbrella term for, an umbrella term for practices that help us access our own spirituality, connect with nature, go within. But what you're saying is, you said before, you are not a person who is Lakota and using Lakota traditions, or a person who is not and using those traditions. And it's really so important to be, for people who are new to this, to be aware that many Indigenous people have been disallowed the right to practice their spiritual traditions throughout history. And so we want to be really mindful of
Absolutely.
the fact that this isn't about taking somebody else's traditions and repackaging them and using them as our own. This is about honoring and respecting these themes that we might find across traditions.
That we do find, right, all over the globe. And I do talk about in the book and elsewhere some of the really horrific history in our own country, really all over the world. We can find examples of how what we would now put under, often under the umbrella of shamanic practice or spiritual practice, how there have been just terrible legal and cultural genocide, um,
Theft,
theft. I mean, just
appropriation.
uh, of all sorts, of all sorts. So it's really important to acknowledge that history, to be aware of that history, especially as, you know, in our culture right now, a lot of the kind of tools of more, I want to say, superficial rituals of some of these traditions have become much more mainstream, right? So if it's like, oh, okay, you can get smudge at anthropology or whatever, it's like that's not the practice. So we need to be really careful in um, not taking from, and also not conflating some of the tools with what's actually happening beneath the surface, right? The tools are the tools are not the substance. Um,
And you know, I think generally in the wellness arena, it's very tricky, right? Because a lot of things that have become very mainstream, where it's hard for a lot of people to even know where things come from, um, you know, come from specific places. And again, it's just, you know, it's important to just to give credit where credit is due. You know, most of us are not going to be the inventors of something.
right.
Um, so yeah, I'm just really glad that you brought that up, because I do think it can be tricky. But what you're really talking about is this way of connecting to earth, connecting to nature, connecting to our own inner divinity through using tools that, you know, many cultures have used historically, and that even now modern psychology uses, like things that are hypnotic, like drumming, things like guided imagery, things like intention setting, or journaling after, so we don't forget those insights that we have.
Which is so
Um,
important, right? And the tools are important too, right? So on the and there's so much that's paradoxical, right? So we absolutely need to make sure that we're not appropriating, and to make sure that we understand some of the history. And at the same time, not at the same time, separate issue, when there are things that are in some ways more universal, right? So if we look, you know, I can say I'm not from any number of cultural traditions, but some of the cultures that I do come from, if we go far enough back, they also are part of that core tradition, right? When I think about accessibility, oh, I was going to make a point about tools, right? I said the tools are not the thing, right? The
yes.
tools, right? But on the other hand, tools are also sacred, right? We think about um, using the drum itself can be a very powerful, um, the drum itself has a spirit, right? So if we're really coming from the place where everything has a spirit, well, that applies to our tools as well. If we treat our tools as sacred objects, they are important, right? So it's like the paradox of, we just can't conflate them with the thing itself, right? With the
So glad
practice
you said
itself.
that.
Okay, so it's it's a little more complicated than my prior statement. Part of this, of both wanting to make sure we acknowledge and don't take anything that is not ours,
And
and
package it as if it is.
and repackage it as if it is, right? But at the same time, where are there, we all globally, we need help right now. Individually, we need help. We need to figure out how to survive these times, right? How do we stay healthy personally? How do we survive this period collectively? And if there is wisdom that is resident, for me, increasingly my work is focused on the wisdom that is resident in place, that is resident in nature, as you're pointing out. If there is wisdom from traditions that, in the big picture, we share as human beings, that we are now entering a place where we can share with one another, right? Not by repackaging, but by accessing authentically, personally, right? Not by saying, oh, you do this thing, I'll do this thing too, but by going within and by inviting direct connection, right? In some ways, it feels like it's our imperative to do that, right? Not to take it, but to do it personally, right? And that in many ways is part of all of our history, right? And that it becomes complicated. Some of us don't know what our background is, right? If we make it only about biology, we also can be losing and separating people unfairly, right? So when I think about how, if we're focusing on direct revelation, then that doesn't exclude people who, for example, are adopted and don't know what their genetic history is, right? Who don't know what their family is, or people who, for whatever reason, have been estranged from their culture. There is a way to reconnect spiritually, right? Many of us from many, many different cultures are estranged from the history of that culture.
And like you said, to give credit where credit is due, and to be thoughtful and respectful. And that's very different from claiming a lineage we don't have.
Right.
And
Sadly happening.
Yeah, and something that you said a moment ago is that right now we have a world that is in such turmoil. And a lot of the practices that you talk about in your book and that people can hear about in the full interview are things that can help us open up to connection to something greater than ourselves, to nature and community around us, to be more thoughtful how we engage not only in our spiritual life, but in the real world, in a way that is thoughtful and respectful and reciprocal.
Right.
I thought that was great. I'm so glad though that you address this, because it is something that is tricky to navigate. Yeah. And especially again in the wellness arena.
Many different traditions, cultures, regions of the world have histories of using different plants, different substances, burning them, using their oils, using them as ways to clear space, literally and symbolically, and to also evoke, call on benevolent spiritual forces, right? So those two things, the clearing and the calling, are not unique to smudge, right? They're not unique to sage. So wherever you come from, you can find, I remember growing up in the Catholic Church, right? The censer and the incense, right? You think about
frankincense,
shrines
myrrh.
In Asia, like ancestral. I can give you lots and lots of different examples. But without coming up with the specific substance, what I would say to you, if you want to be really authentic to yourself, right? If you know your biological ancestral roots, you could think about doing some research about where you come from, right? If you want to go history and region, do some research about what plants were used there, right? If you think about your religion of origin, you could think about looking into what plants, what substances, what oils, right? I mean, frankincense. I'm going back to like some of my Catholic roots. But also, you know, and I've said this kind of multiple times throughout our talk, thinking about direct revelation, personal experience as being the most authentic way to have a spiritual practice that's meaningful to you, right? So whatever plant was burned, you know, in the country where your great grandparents came from to clear the air or to call on the sacred may or may not connect to you, right? Or whatever was burned or not burned in the church you went to growing up may or may not connect for you. But wherever you live right now, maybe you go out and you sit and you really ask the spirits of the land where you are right now and see what offers itself to you, right? Or you go to the library and you research it. Well, maybe not the library anymore. You Google it.
Somebody does.
All right, but so you can come up with your own direct connection. So it's understandable that as sage and smudge have become kind of the de facto sacred clearing method, that people can be upset that that is something that is sacred that has been taken as this is the thing we do, right? Ah, we burn this, we wave it around, we're clear. But it doesn't mean that burning sacred plants is necessarily appropriation in and of itself, because that's something that's happened around the world. So if we take another step and we do it thoughtfully and we think about what plant are we using, and by the way, if we choose plants that are grown responsibly and are not being, you know, having their bark stripped off, you know, in a way that's really detrimental to the environment and to those plants because now they've become popular, you know, we can create our own authentic practice of using sacred plants and using smoke, right?
Using smoke, using essential oils. You know, I'm thinking, I remember a woman I met years ago and it just popped in my head. She used to say that, you know, if you have like negative energy or spirits in your house, put vinegar in a dish on the mantle. I have no idea where that comes from, but it meant something to her.
Right.
Using salt as a way of neutralizing. And as we've talked about before, I think that, you know, some of these things as a psychologist, I'm thinking about the psychological value in concretizing something, using something concrete to represent something psychological or
Right.
spiritual.
Right.
Like salt neutralizing something we've written down on paper that we want to really imagine, you know, neutralizing and moving out of our lives. I mean, psychologically, that is also very powerful.
Yeah, like that's the power of ritual. And this goes to, you know, my earlier comment about tools is that, you know, on the one hand, is it the substance or is it the intention you put behind it? You know, rituals can have power and tools can have power themselves, but it's the energy you're putting behind it. So I think taking you know, taking some sage and sometimes people say, oh, I did this, but it didn't get any better. Well, if you're just doing this, right?
Going through the motions.
Right, but you've got to marry the seen and the unseen. You know, there's got to be some substance with the energetic substance, you know, married to the motions. So I think what you're bringing up here of the psychology is also really important. And sometimes having something concrete, and to that end, you know, there may be kind of the chemical effect of certain things like salt, right? Or like burning. There's some studies have been done, or like what has, we know that plants have medicinal properties, right? Whether we're burning them or having the oils or using them, ingesting them or whatever. But you could experiment with creating something yourself, right? There's things that have history and there are things that you create for yourself. Maybe there's a certain flower or a certain tree that is particularly meaningful to you. And that's what you use as your smudge. Like, make sure it's okay to burn it and it's not toxic or whatever, right? Like, full disclosure, I don't know what that is, but do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you so much for addressing that, Mara. It's helpful and it's important, and it's especially important now. Well, thank you again.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate your taking the time to talk about that and to speak with me today, Mara. So I hope everyone will check out the full interview where Mara and I talk about everything from her book to connection to nature and animals, and how these practices can help us to be more self-compassionate and compassionate with the world in general. And remember that we are all connected. So stay tuned for the interview. And again, Mara, thank you so much.
Thank you.